This is the Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's Show. It is the debut episode. I'm Ken Pollia, and I'm here to bring you Alzheimer's and dementia expert, best-selling author, and world-renowned speaker, Lisa Skinner. Lisa, how are you?
Hi, Ken. How are you?
Doing well.
So glad to have you here with me. And hello to all of you who have tuned in to listen to this episode of Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's. Again, I'm Lisa Skinner, your host, and I'd like to shout out a very warm welcome to all who have joined us. The purpose of this show is to talk about every aspect of Alzheimer's disease, and that's going to include the good, the bad, and the ugly. Our goal is to get to the truth, dispel the lies and myths, and unveil the secret faces of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia in order to understand what it's truly like to live with a brain disease. My goal has always been to zoom outside the paradigm of it exclusively being a memory loss condition in order to shift people's understanding of just how dramatically this disease impacts the lives of those who have it, as well as their caregivers, the family members, and for that matter, anybody who is involved in the life of a person living with dementia. My story started almost 50 years ago when my grandmother began displaying some very unusual behaviors. She only lived a couple miles from our home, and so I grew up and had a very close relationship with her, and we visited often. And then I remember the first time I went to visit her, and we were sitting down talking, and she started telling me about these birds that lived in her mattress. And she would tell me that they would come out at night when she was sleeping and start pecking at her face. Then she'd point out to her walls and run her finger kind of imaginarily along the wall, and she said, and I also see rats running along my walls every day. And then she proceeded to tell me about the men that were constantly trying to break into her home to either harm her or steal her personal possessions, especially her jewelry. I didn't know what to make of these stories she was telling me. They all sounded so far-fetched, but I had never known my grandmother to make up stories, to lie, or to embellish anything, and I desperately wanted to believe her, but, I'd say to myself, how could any of these things be truly happening? I even went to the extent one day of leading her into her bedroom, the mattress, and saying, Grandma, tell me where these birds are living and where they can come out of your mattress and peck at your face. Well, she didn't have an answer, obviously, because what she was telling me wasn't true, but she was brilliant with her response. She said, Lisa, they are just very clever, and left it at that. Anyway, my grandmother was also in her delusions, her new delusions, was calling the police 3, 4, 5 times a day. And initially, with her first call, reporting these stories to the police department, they sent officers out to check out her claims. And they didn't find anything or any evidence of rats or birds in the mattress, and she could not demonstrate to the police that anything had been stolen or that they were trying to harm her. Anyway, this kept up for week after week after week, and the police department finally tracked my mother down, went over to our house. I was standing right there when the police officer said to my mother, Ma'am, you really need to do something about your mother. She is a nut. She keeps calling us. She's 3, 4, 5 times a day. We just don't have the time, and we certainly don't have the resources to take the calls, let alone send officers out to her house. You really need to stop this and do something with her. She obviously cannot live alone anymore. Well, the only thing that I was really focused on and what I was hearing was she's a nut. And I was so incensed at hearing a police officer call my grandma a nut because I knew she wasn't. I knew there was something seriously wrong with her. And the police had no empathy for even thinking it was some kind of a condition or a disease. They just leaped to the assumption that she was off her rocker. And that today has stuck with me. So anyway, I became a behavior specialist and have spent nearly 30 years working in the elder care industry, counseling families on how to best live with this disease so they could focus on what really matters, which is what we all want for our loved ones, spending quality time. I've also authored, as Ken told you, several books. I have a training program on the subject, and believe it or not, have watched 8 of my family members to date fall prey to one of the brain diseases that causes dementia. I'm also a certified dementia care trainer through the Alzheimer's Association. You know, there are so many aspects of living with dementia that are unexpected and can surface out of nowhere at any time. I call these the hidden or secret faces of dementia, and as many of you know, they show up unannounced and are completely unpredictable. That's why it's so important to be prepared for anything that shows up on this journey with dementia. Knowledge is power, and I'm here to arm you with that knowledge so you, too, will have the power to negotiate the many challenges you will face having a loved one or caring for someone with dementia. So, in the same fashion as Fräulein Maria in The Sound of Music, when she wanted to teach the Von Trapp children how to sing, well, what did she tell them? Let's start at the very beginning, and it's a very good place to start. So that's what I'm going to do, too. I'm going to start at the very beginning with explaining what the difference is between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So here we go. Alzheimer's is a specific disease. Dementia is not a disease at all. A lot of people believe that they are both diseases, but let me clarify that. Alzheimer's is a brain disease. Dementia is a syndrome, and the term dementia is used as an umbrella term that really refers to the symptoms that accompany the brain disease. And believe it or not, there are actually over 100 brain diseases that cause dementia. Alzheimer's is the most common one and the one that we hear of most often, and the one that impacts the most people. More people suffer from Alzheimer's disease than any of the other brain diseases like Lewy body disease or frontotemporal lobe dementia or vascular dementia. When we hear dementia, we automatically relate it to Alzheimer's disease. So just to kind of put this into perspective for everybody, when we refer to dementia, again, we're referring to the symptoms that accompany the brain disease. And the symptoms are caused by the damage that the brain disease is doing to our neurons or the cells in our brain. So if you were coming down with a cold or the flu or something along those lines, some virus that's making you sick, you would go to your doctor or you'd call your advice nurse and you would explain to them how you're feeling. And what you're explaining are the symptoms that you're feeling. Maybe you have body aches and pains. Maybe you're running a fever. Maybe you have a horrible headache or earaches. These are all symptoms. That's what we use the term dementia for. And there are also over 100 symptoms that show up as a result of Alzheimer's disease and the other brain diseases that cause dementia. So just think of it in that relationship. Dementia refers to the symptoms that show up, and the Alzheimer's and the other diseases that I mentioned are the actual brain diseases that are causing these symptoms. Other aspects of living with Alzheimer's disease that people are not even aware exist or are not aware that they are a common part of the disease, for example, are wandering, delusions, and false beliefs. There's hallucinations, repetitious behaviors, not recognizing your loved ones, suspiciousness, and paranoia. These are only some of the common behaviors associated with dementia. My grandmother was a perfect example of a person living with Alzheimer's disease that displayed the gamut of the symptoms. She had the suspiciousness, the paranoia, the hallucinations, the delusions. Not everybody displays these behaviors, but they are all very common with dementia. Living with dementia is unlike anything you can imagine. It would be like falling into a rabbit hole and entering a world unlike anything you've ever known, one that is completely unfamiliar. That said, it is equally important to not only understand what will occur on a day-to-day basis, but why these things occur. What is happening to the person's changing brain as they progress through the various stages of Alzheimer's disease? Then, once you understand it, you can hopefully be prepared for what might challenge you day to day. And that really is the key. It's being prepared and not being caught off guard. So, we're going to talk about all of this because it takes very specialized knowledge and training to know how to effectively respond to situations that arise with a damaged brain, so as to avoid any situation from escalating into an extreme one. And an extreme situation is what we call catastrophic reactions. And unfortunately, no amount of reasoning can talk the person experiencing many of these symptoms out of their beliefs. So we must rely on alternative strategies to manage them. According to the Alzheimer's Association, approximately 1 out of 3 Alzheimer's disease sufferers will develop paranoia and or suspiciousness, and 90% will display behavioral impulses. Why? Well, the real work of our brain goes on in individual cells called neurons. An adult brain contains about 100 billion of these neurons with branches that connect at more than 100 trillion points. These signals, which are traveling from neuron to neuron for the basis of memories, thoughts, and feelings, these neurons are the cells that are destroyed by Alzheimer's disease. To understand what's happening to the person suffering from the brain disease, these are just some of the cognitive losses that you can expect to see in people living with Alzheimer's disease. Language is impacted. They may display several forms of language impairment known as aphasia, such as difficulty finding. Ken?
Yep.
I had to stop the recording because Nikki is barking.
Just call it out and let her bark and tell the audience what's going on.
What?
Okay.
Do you want me to start over?
Well, we did forget the intro part. You were supposed to toss it back to me real quick so I could do the intro.
Oh! All right.
But I could do that at the end.
we need to have the intro. Yeah.
Do you want to start over?
Yeah, I think so. And because I did completely forget to send it back
I'm going
to
say
you.
how. Okay, so here, I'll go over it one more time. I'm going to say how you're doing, Lisa. You're going to say, just speak very, very briefly about, how you appreciate your listeners, and then you're going to say, but before we start, Ken has an announcement, and then you're going to do that again before we end.
Okay. I'm going to write it down this time. So how's it sounding so far?
It sounds good. I think it's just fine. And honestly, I think if there's a dog barking in the background, just call it out. Just say, hey, to my audience, that's my, tell them the name of your dog and just make it part of the show.
Let me go see what she's barking at. She doesn't bark a lot. She usually barks when there's a delivery at the door. So let me go see if there's something there, because she came running out of the bedroom and is standing at the front door barking. So let me just go see. And other than that, she really doesn't bark much. Nothing there. How is the pace of my voice?
I think you're doing absolutely fine. Yeah, you're doing great.
Okay, good. Nikki, you come up here. Come on. Let me look at one thing here. Oh, to stop and, okay, I did that. To stop and save the recording, press, okay, second time. I'm not seeing anything where you can erase. So I think if I just hit the recording thing, it'll just record right over the first recording.
Uh-huh.
So let's try it. All right, so I'm going to hit the record button, start counting to 10, and then start, okay?
Got it.
Okay, here we go.
This is the Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's show. It is our debut episode. I'm Ken Pollia, and I'm here to bring you Alzheimer's and dementia expert, best-selling author, and world-renowned speaker, Lisa Skinner. Lisa, how are you?
Hi, Ken. I'm doing great. And hello to all of you who have tuned in to listen to this debut episode of Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's. I'm Lisa Skinner, your host. And I'd like to shout out a very warm welcome to all who have joined us. But before we start, Ken does have a few announcements to make to y'all.
Yes, for our audience, we want to make sure that everyone knows that we're brought to you by Global Media Network, LLC, and Passionate World Talk Radio. Passionate World Talk Radio, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC, and our motto is educate, enlighten, and entertain. Welcome, everyone. This is the Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's show. It is the debut episode. I'm Ken Pollia, and I'm here to bring you Alzheimer's and dementia expert, best-selling author, and world-renowned speaker, Lisa Skinner. Lisa, how are you?
Hi, Ken. I'm doing great. I hope you are too. And hello to all of you who have tuned in to listen to this episode of Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's. Again, I'm Lisa Skinner, your host, and I'd like to shout out a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us. But before we start, Ken does have a few announcements to make.
Yeah, we want to let our audience know that we're brought to you by Global Media Network, LLC, and Passionate World Talk Radio. Passionate World Talk Radio is a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. And our motto is educate, enlighten, and entertain. Now, since this is the debut episode, we're going to start at the beginning. Lisa, I believe you're going to tell a very personal story, which I'm looking forward to hearing. And I believe you're going to start with some of the fundamentals, some of the building blocks that will lead to a caregiver's understanding of this disease. Is that right?
That's exactly what I have planned. I would like everybody to know that the purpose of this show is to talk about every single aspect of Alzheimer's disease over the weekly episodes. This is going to include the good, the bad, and of course the ugly. Our goal is to get to the truth, dispel the lies and myths, and unveil the secret faces of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia in order to understand what it's truly like to live with a brain disease. My goal is to zoom outside the paradigm of it exclusively being a memory loss condition and be able to shift people's understanding of just how dramatically this disease impacts the lives of those who have it, as well as the caregivers, the family members, and for that matter, anybody who is involved in the life of a person living with dementia. My story started almost 50 years ago when my grandmother began displaying some very unusual behaviors. I grew up with my grandmother. She lived very close to us. She was only a few miles away, and I spent a lot of time with her. When I was a teenager, I distinctly remember going over to her house this one day, and we sat down to have a visit, and she started telling me about these birds that were living in her mattress and that they were coming out at night and pecking at her face. She pointed to her living room wall and with her finger demonstrated how these rats were constantly running along her walls. And then she proceeded to tell me about these men that were constantly trying to break into her home to either harm her or to steal her personal belongings, especially her jewelry. I did not know what to think of these stories that my grandmother was sharing with me. I had never, ever known her to embellish anything, to lie to me, to lie to anybody. But what she was telling me sounded so far-fetched that it was just unbelievable to think that these things were really happening. I even went to the extent one time of leading her into her bedroom, pushed her mattress up and say, "Grandma, show me. Where are these birds living, and how are they getting out of your mattress to peck at your face?" Well, of course, she didn't have an answer because what she was telling me absolutely wasn't true. It was all in her mind, but she had a brilliant response. She said, "Oh, they're there, Lisa, but they are very, very clever." How can I argue with that? Well, as time went on, my grandmother started calling the police 3, 4, sometimes 5 or 6 times a day and reporting these same stories to the police that I just shared with you. And initially they did send officers out to check her claims. They, of course, couldn't find any evidence of any rats or any birds or any burglars. And finally, after weeks of her calling day in and day out, the police chief tracked my mother down, came over to our house, sat her down, and I happened to be standing right there listening to the conversation. And she said, "Ma'am, I'm here to tell you, you really need to do something about your mother. She is an absolute nut, calling us day in and day out, reporting things that absolutely could not be true. You really need to do something with her. She obviously cannot live alone in her home anymore." And all I really heard was him say, "She's a nut." I knew my grandmother wasn't a nut. Yes, there was something happening to her. I knew something was seriously happening to her. But she didn't all of a sudden overnight become a nut. As it turns out, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Back then, they called it senile dementia. But to this day, it still infuriates me that this police officer showed absolutely no empathy, that there could possibly be an explanation for her behavior, and just dismissed it as being mental illness. And unfortunately, today we're still seeing that. A lot of people relate Alzheimer's disease with people having a mental illness, and it is not a mental illness. It is a disease. Anyway, fast forward, I ended up becoming a behavior specialist, and I have spent nearly 30 years working in the elder care industry, counseling families on how to best live with this disease so they can focus on what really matters, which is spending quality time with their loved ones. I've also authored several books. I have developed a training program on the subject, and believe it or not, have watched 8 of my personal family members fall prey to one of these brain diseases that cause dementia. I'm also a certified dementia care trainer through the Alzheimer's Association. I really want you to know that there are so many aspects of living with dementia that are unexpected and can surface out of nowhere at any time. I call these the hidden or secret faces of dementia, and as many of you know, they show up unannounced and are completely unpredictable. That's why it's so important to be prepared for anything that shows up on this journey. Knowledge is power, and I'm here to arm you with that knowledge so you too will have the power to negotiate the many challenges you will face having a loved one or caring for someone with dementia. So in the same fashion as Fräulein Maria in The Sound of Music, when she wanted to teach the Von Trapp children how to sing, what did she tell them? She said, "Let's start at the very beginning, because it's a very good place to start." And that's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to start at the very beginning by explaining what the difference is between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So they are two completely different things. Alzheimer's disease is a specific disease. It's a brain disease. Dementia is not a disease at all. It's a syndrome. And the term is used as an umbrella term to describe the symptoms that occur as a result of Alzheimer's disease or one of the over 100 brain diseases that do cause dementia. Most of us are familiar with Alzheimer's disease. It is the most common brain disease that causes dementia. There's also vascular dementia and Lewy body dementia and frontotemporal lobe dementia. These are not as common as Alzheimer's disease, and less people suffer from those brain diseases than they do from Alzheimer's disease, but every single one of them causes dementia. So when we're using that term, dementia, we're really referring to the symptoms that show up. The brain is changing. The brain cells are being damaged by the brain disease. And eventually causes the signs and the symptoms that we see surface on a daily basis. So to put it in perspective for you, if you're not feeling well and you go to your doctor or you call your advice nurse and they want to know what's going on and you start describing your symptoms, in other words, you're describing how you feel. I have a fever. I have body aches. I am all stuffed up. My ears hurt. You're basically describing your symptoms to your medical professional based on the way you're feeling. That is what bucket dementia falls into. So when we use the term dementia, we're really talking about the symptoms that show up. And, of course, there's over 100 of those, too. So we're just really putting a general used broad term into perspective, and we're referring to the symptoms that show up with a brain disease. So hopefully that really helps clarify the difference between those two terms. You know, the other aspects of living with Alzheimer's disease that people are not even aware exists or are not aware that they're even a common part of the disease, for example, are wandering, delusions, false beliefs, hallucinations, repetitive behaviors, not recognizing loved ones, suspiciousness, and paranoia. And these are only some of the common behaviors that are associated with dementia. I use my grandma again as an example. She really displayed the gamut of the extreme symptoms and behaviors that we see with Alzheimer's disease. She had the delusions or false beliefs. She had the hallucinations. She was suspicious and paranoid. Not everybody displays those behaviors, but I have to tell you they are actually very common with this disease. And everybody who has the disease experiences it differently. We have a saying in our industry, if you've seen one person with dementia, you've seen one person with dementia. Because, again, everybody experiences it differently. So they're going to display different signs and symptoms, one from another. Living with dementia, as you can imagine, is unlike anything. It's like falling into a rabbit hole and entering a world unlike anything you've ever known, one that becomes completely unfamiliar. That said, it's equally important to not only understand what will occur on a day-to-day basis, but why these things occur. What is happening to the person's changing brain as they progress through the various stages of Alzheimer's disease? To understand this, then you can hopefully be prepared for what might challenge you day to day. And that's really the key. Being prepared and not being caught off guard, as many people are. We're going to talk about all of this because it takes very specialized knowledge and very specialized training to know how to effectively respond to situations that arise with a damaged brain. So as to avoid any situation from escalating into an extreme one that we call a catastrophic reaction, but unfortunately, the truth of the matter is no amount of reasoning can talk the person experiencing many of these symptoms out of their beliefs. So we must rely on alternative strategies in order to manage them. According to the Alzheimer's Association, approximately 1 out of 3 Alzheimer's disease sufferers will develop paranoia or suspiciousness, and 90% will display behavioral impulses. Why? Well, the real work of our brain goes on in individual cells called neurons. An adult brain, believe it or not, contains about 100 billion of these neurons with branches that connect at more than 100 trillion points. These signals, which are traveling from neuron to neuron, form the basis of memories, thoughts, and our feelings. These neurons are the cells that are destroyed by Alzheimer's disease. Well, these are some of the cognitive losses that you can expect to see in people with Alzheimer's disease. Again, it's not just memory loss and confusion. Their language is impacted. They may display several forms of language impairments known as aphasia, such as difficulty finding or remembering words, difficulty with rules of syntax and grammar. However, the physical ability to speak can remain intact. Their judgment is impaired. Their reasoning skills are often compromised, resulting in poor judgment, such as not thinking about looking for oncoming cars when crossing a street. They'll just walk right off the curb into the street. Their perception is compromised. Their eyesight itself may be fine, and the brain's ability to accurately interpret what one is seeing may be impaired and distorted, which can ultimately diminish their ability to recognize an otherwise familiar object or place, as well as impair their ability to use common objects. So if all of a sudden your loved one can't operate a kitchen appliance, like a coffee maker that they've been operating for years, it's because their perception is damaged. Their concentration becomes impaired, which is the ability to pay attention or concentrate also becomes impaired. It inhibits a person with dementia from paying attention to what they're supposed to be doing, like eating a meal. Their ability to continue to task sequence is lost. And pretty much everything we do on a day-to-day basis is based on learning the sequencing of tasks or the series of steps in a certain order that it takes to complete that task. People with dementia inherently lose the ability to follow the sequence of tasks, for example, like the steps it takes to get dressed, the steps it takes to brush your teeth, resulting in total confusion as to how to perform these basic tasks of daily living. They cannot remember what they're supposed to do next. These are all things you can expect to see. The early signs of dementia may be very subtle and hard to distinguish between the process of normal aging forgetfulness and the more serious beginnings of a brain disease, such as problems with memory, especially with the recall of recent events, confusion, personality changes, apathy and withdrawal, and the loss of ability to do everyday simple tasks. Because people with brain disease suffer from impaired reasoning, they may easily misinterpret others' intentions and have difficulty understanding what is being communicated to them. Their ability to separate fact from fiction becomes impaired. In a person living with dementia, the ability to perceive things the same way we do with healthy brains will affect the person's judgment both visually and conceptually. Their level of confusion will increase over time, and that's because they are losing the ability to make sense of what their senses take in. Consequently, this can produce many adverse reactions such as fright and or combative behavior. We all know that the brain is at the center of our thought processes and is central to our lives. It takes in information from our daily experiences and enables us to make sense of our world. Our memories really are the threads that sew our lives together in sequence and in continuity. However, when our memory begins to fail, the tie to our lives unravel, resulting in a nearly complete loss of oneself. And these are just some of the changes that are occurring in the brains of those who live with Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, and what we will be taking a deep dive into on each episode of Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's. But before I close out, Ken has a couple more announcements to make. Ken, take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. And we want to thank each and every one of our listeners for tuning in to the Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's show with your host, Lisa Skinner. Lisa, I've been working with you on this topic for quite a few years now, and I just want to say that I never tire of hearing about the fundamentals. And it reminds me of, growing up playing sports, playing baseball, and how the coaches used to always say, always practice the fundamentals, right? Even professional athletes continue practicing the fundamentals again and again and again. And so I think when it comes to caregiving, when it comes to Alzheimer's and dementia, and when it comes to brain disease, you can never have too much of the fundamentals. So I just really want to thank you for, A, telling a personal story, and for B, starting at the beginning so that we all have a basic foundational understanding of how to deal with this disease. I think it's incredibly important. So for
Ken,
our listeners,
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's really important for our listeners to know and to be aware this is a very long-coursed disease. My grandmother, for example, lived with it for 20 years. The average length of time that a person lives with Alzheimer's disease from the start of the symptoms or the onset of the symptoms is 8 and 15 years. That's a really long time for people to not only live with this disease, but be a part of their journey. So these fundamentals that Ken is referring to are so important to make lives easier and less stressful by knowing the best practices and how to respond to the behaviors that do show up as a part of this disease.
And Lisa, to add to that, I'm imagining that you would have benefited 20 years ago from having a resource like this radio show, like your book, like all the information that can be found at truthliesalzheimers.com, which is your author homepage.
I've had so many of my clients tell me I wished we had had some of these resources to refer to when we were going through it. And I can honestly say 50 years ago when my grandmother started talking about birds living in her mattress and rats running along her wall, boy, did we wish we had resources to fall back on. So I am so happy to be able to provide a resource for people who are going through this very difficult disease. Thank you. I also want to thank everybody for listening today. We have so much to cover in the upcoming episodes. Information that will hopefully help you and that you will find helpful and valuable while you struggle through this with your loved one, or if you're caring for somebody with Alzheimer's disease or one of the other brain diseases that causes dementia. Remember, dementia awareness is every day. And kindness is the ability to speak with love, listen with compassion, and act with patience. All very necessary attributes to have to be able to outlast Alzheimer's disease. One last note, this show is about you and how my expertise and strategies will help you and your loved ones have an easier time while struggling through this disease. Therefore, I'd love it if you'd send me your comments and suggestions for what topics you'd like me to cover on this weekly show. Send them to my personal email address, which is dementiawhisperer1@gmail.com. And that's the number 1, not spelled out O-N-E. Again, dementiawhisperer1@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. I really will look forward to receiving your thoughts and ideas. And in the meantime, take care of you. If
and
you're
Lisa,
listening, yeah?
We also want our listeners to know where this program can be found. If they want to download it for future reference, it can be found on our website at passionateworldtalkradio.com under the Shows tab. If our listeners are on YouTube, it can be found at /Passionate World Talk Radio. If our listeners are on Facebook, they can search for Lisa Skinner Author. And if they like what they hear and they want to purchase the book, which I highly recommend, they can find it on Lisa's website, truthlies.alzheimers.com. If you're into audiobooks, I know, Lisa, you're particularly proud of the audio version of this book, which I know you can find on Apple Books as well as under all major book resellers. And Lisa, you're pretty much on every social media website. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
Just real quickly, the books are also available on Amazon and through the other fine booksellers. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, where it will be available, or if you got here through our social media page, please leave your comments or questions, and we will absolutely do the best to address them. Again, we are here for you. One of my clients told me one time, she called me over to her home to hopefully get some information, and she said to me, "You really need to write a book. It would be selfish of you not to share the information that you know about living with this disease." And it was at that time that I finally pulled the trigger and put the pen to paper and wrote the book, because she was so right. And I want to share everything I know with all of you so your lives can be a little less stressful through this disease. Thanks again for being here, and we'll look forward to having you back next week.